Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is absolutism in Eastern Europe. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline on the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. You ready? Let's get started. Now, we left off discussing the big changes in government, essentially, in Western Europe. About absolutism in France and Spain compared to the constitutionalism you experience in England. But in Eastern Europe, things are quite different. Now, it's not that they don't try to develop absolutism, and the title of this lecture obviously is Absolutism in Eastern Europe. But there's a lot of big changes going on. And what we do see here is a change in power. And as I kind of titled in my notes, changing faces and changing places. And there's some cool acronym you can learn to try to memorize this that could be very well helpful, mnemonic aid, known as HOP-RAP. And basically what we see the dissolution of three major empires who are just aging. They're getting old, they're getting tired, they are going to basically go away. And they're going to give way to three new kingdoms. And so we see these three old empires, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Empire. And what we see here is the Holy Roman Empire, religious divisions due to the Reformation, all those wars of religion, 30 Years' War, during the 16th and 17th century are going to completely split Germany between Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinist princes. And in doing so, it's kind of the final dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, as far as a powerful central figure. Then you have the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, they just could not maintain possession of their possessions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And it's not that they themselves were necessarily falling apart from within, like the Holy Roman Empire, but they just were not strong enough to defend themselves against the emergence of the Austrian and Russian empires. Now, for centuries, the Ottoman Empire under the Sultan, who did have absolute power, was built on expansion. But when they're no longer able to expand into Western Europe, that power and absolute nature begins to decline, leading eventually to their disintegration. Now remember, they're still going to be around for hundreds of years. They're a player in World War I, which is their kind of final nail in the coffin. But as a major empire, they are in decline. And then we have Poland. Their issue was more political in structure. They had a concept known as liberum veto, or liberum veto. And the idea was that in the Polish parliament, for any change to go into effect, it must be by unanimous consent. Yeah, just picture modern United States. Every change politically, lawmaking, tax policy must be unanimous among lawmakers. It's not happening. And thus, there's very little they could do to actually strengthen or save their kingdom. And so when Russia and Prussia begin to exert their influence, they begin to convince some members, maybe even pay them off, but convince them that, oh no, you should dissent. The whole liberum veto thing, just vote against it. And in doing so, it severely weakens Poland as an empire. And by 1800, Poland will cease to exist as a sovereign state for, again, about 100 years, as Austria, Prussia, and Russia kind of divide Poland up. Now, and thus, as a result of these constant changes and stuff we're going to talk about coming up, Western Eastern European absolutism will differ greatly from, say, the French absolutism. Eastern absolutism was based on a powerful nobility, a weak middle class, and an oppressed peasantry composed of serfs. Wow. Every bit of that sentence was the exact opposite of France. In France, the nobles' power had been limited, but in Eastern Europe, nobles were strong. The middle class was strong in France, but the middle class was weak in Eastern Europe. And while both employed, peasants and heavy use of peasants, there was no serfdom in Western Europe. And therefore, there kind of are three kind of important methods for gaining absolute power. So, number one, the kings will impose and collect permanent taxes without consent of the subject. So, the ability of the king to tax, that's a hallmark of absolutism. Number two, the idea of states having permanent standing armies. And then number three, states conduct foreign relations with other states as they pleased. And so, even though we talked a lot extensively about how King Louis XIV and previously to him, Cardinal Richelieu was able to develop absolutism, absolutism does develop in the East, but just very, very, almost diametrically opposed to how it did in France. And so, let's talk about this big issue first of serfdom in Eastern Europe. As remember, we abolished it in Western Europe following the plague. Now, likewise, after 1300, lords in Eastern Europe will revive serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges. Now, this is opposed to Western Europe, where after the plague, they said, oh no, we need greater mobility to recover economically from the plague. But in Eastern Europe, they said went backwards. They regressed. And they reinstituted serfdom as a way to deal with these economic challenges. This is especially the case in places like Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Russia. And so this drop in population in the 1400s as a result of the plague, that this became a huge labor shortage problem like it did in the West. However, in the East, lords began demanding that the kings begin to implement laws restricting the mobility of serfs. So rather than free them and give them free reign and free movement to help them, as they did in Western Europe, they instead kind of entrenched it or re-entrenched it. And by 1500, Prussian territories had laws that required runaway peasants to be hunted down and returned to their lords. Even non-peasant serfs were affected. They were actually known as robots, because in certain areas of Eastern Europe, peasants were required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord. So almost half your week would be required work to your local lords. Again, it's tantamount to slavery. This is serfdom at its worst. But then things get worse following the plague. As the Western Europe is going through the Renaissance and ultimately Reformation, serfdom gets consolidated in the East between 1500 and 1650. Hereditary serfdom was reestablished in both Poland, Russia, and Prussia by the 1600s. By 1600, Poland nobles had gained complete control over their peasants, including the imposition of the death penalty on whoever they wished. And again, this is why there's a fine line definition between this and, say, chattel slavery. The only real difference between, say, this Polish Eastern European serfdom and slavery is, well, technically there was some freedom, possibly, maybe, but the bigger difference ultimately is the race-based nature of chattel slavery. And so why was serfdom in Eastern Europe and not Western Europe? And you realize most people, well, economics dictated. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because the West was also devastated by the Black Death, resulting in labor shortages, and did not fall victim to the same idea of re-entrenching serfdom. And therefore, it really comes down to political reasons. It was about supremacy of noble landlords. Remember, most kings in Eastern Europe, due to the strength of nobility, were essentially kind of first among equals. In other words, they were king, but largely they were just another noble who was slightly above that of the regular nobles. Again, they were first among equals. And therefore, both the kings, princes, and nobles are all directly benefiting from serfdom as a way to shore up their political clout. In addition, the constant warfare in Eastern Europe and political chaos resulted in the noble landlord class increasing their political power at the expense of monarchs. So you need to control these serfs, it was thought, as a way to shore up your own political clout and power. Because remember, there's constant warfare, you need soldiers, you need economic means to maintain your status. So let's kind of go through this. This is why and how serfdom stays around. Let's talk about some of these ancient empires for a minute. In these new developing empires, namely the Habsburg Empire, within the Austrian Empire. Now, the ruler of Austria was traditionally selected as the Holy Roman Emperor. However, after the War of Spanish Succession that ended in 1713, the Spanish throne was now occupied by Bourbons, and the Habsburg power was concentrated in Austria. So yeah, we're back to the Habsburg issue. Again, after the defeat in the 30 Years' War, after the War of Spanish Succession, the Habsburg power had to refocus their efforts and kind of reconsolidate in Austria. And what is created here is the Austrian Habsburg Empire that will include both Hungary, Austria, and Transylvania, which is, by the way, modern-day Romania. Austria is not a national state. It was a multinational empire that included Austria proper, which included both Germans and Italians. It included Bohemia, including Czechs. It also included Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and Romanians. So this is not a nation, say, like France is, which again makes it very different when it comes to structure of government. You can't necessarily rule as an absolutist monarch the same way St. King Louis XIV did, when you're not dealing with Frenchmen. You're dealing with Germans, Italians, Czechs, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, Romanians. And therefore, there was no one single constitutional system or administration that existed in the empire, because each region had a different legal relationship to the emperor. So let's look at a couple of the rulers here. And again, this is one of those big issues with European history. You have a bunch of different rulers here. Let me drop this down for you so you can see a little easier. You have a bunch of different rulers here that are going to be very similar in name, but each providing a specific function. Now, you remember King Ferdinand II. He was the one who took control of Bohemia after the 30 Years' War. Well, following him was Ferdinand III, and he's the one who will restructure and centralize the government within the provinces of Austria proper. And he's the one who's going to be able to really kind of reorganize after the 30 Years' War. Then we have Leopold I there, who takes over. In Leopold, yes, he will continue the centralization process, but he will also severely restrict Protestant worship. Again, controlling that religious part of it. Again, this is a hallmark of absolutist monarchs. And finally, though, Emperor Charles VI on the far right, he's going to issue in 1713, again, this is the end of this War of Spanish Succession. Again, this is to cement their rule in Austria as the Austrian Empire, as Habsburgs. He's going to issue in 1713 the Pragmatic Sanction. which basically stated that the Habsburg possessions would never be divided and henceforth would be passed on to a single heir. See, looking at the situation after the War of Spanish Succession, saying, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. This can't happen again. We will lose all of our title, all of our power, all of our prestige. And thus they passed this pragmatic sanction as a way to make sure that the lineage of the Habsburg will continue on and rule without digressing. And therefore, as a result of this, there were even a few female rulers, including Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, who will inherit Charles' empire in 1740, and she will rule it for 40 years. But notice, each of these kings is doing one small step to consolidate their power, moving toward absolutism. Now again, it's very different. They're still a strong middle class, and they don't control that entire idea of absolutism because they are dealing with essentially different countries, different peoples, not one national state. So what about Prussia? Well, in Prussia, we have the House of Hohenzollern. Now, this is leading to the growth of what's called Brandenburg. Now, the ruler of Brandenburg was designated as one of 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire back in 1417. And by the 17th century, though, Brandenburg wasn't even significantly involved within the Holy Roman Empire. So at one point, the ruler of Brandenburg was considered one of the premier leaders within the Holy Roman Empire, going back to 1417. One of 7 major players in the Holy Roman Empire. But by the 17th century, Brandenburg is an afterthought. They're not involved hardly at all within the Holy Roman Empire, which for them ends up being a good thing because as the Holy Roman Empire disintegrates, they are going to once again rise. In marriages, through intermarriages and deals of marriage, they are increasingly given the Hohenzollerns control of German principalities in both central and western Germany, as you can see pictured there. Now, what we see here is the rise of a few powerful rulers once again, and you see the spelling there of Hohenzollern. The first one is Frederick William, the Great Elector. Now, he was a strict Calvinist, but he granted religious toleration to Catholics and Jews. As the Great Elector, he establishes Prussia as a great power and lays the foundation for the future unification of Germany in the 19th century. How? Well, he oversees and oversaw the Prussian militarism, creating the most efficient army in Europe. He employed military power and taxation to unify his holdings. That includes the Rhineland, Prussia, and Brandenburg into one strong state. Now, remember I kind of made fun of King Louis XIV in France about how much he spent on his military. King Louis got nothing on Frederick William. Frederick William outspent Louis XIV twofold. Frederick William, through heavy taxation, spent twice as much as France did on military. Now, you may ask, well, what about the nobility? Nobility were strong, yes, but the Prussian nobility were not exempt from military service. And this is where you start seeing that, again, those inclinations of absolutism. Soldiers would serve as tax collectors and policemen, which thus expanded the government's bureaucracy. And by 1653, this hereditary subjugation of serfs became a way of compensating the nobles for support of the crown. So he's like, hey, how do we do this to you? You support me, you pay me taxes, you serve in the military, I rule over you to maintain my power, but you get to keep your serfs hereditary as perpetual, essentially, enslavement. And it works. He also will encourage industry and trade. He will begin to import skilled craftsmen, including Dutch farmers. And he will develop new industries such as woolens, cottons, linens, and velvet, lace, silk, iron. And as a result of this, he's able to start building a great new empire known as Prussia. Now, second in command there is Frederick I, also known as the Ostentatious. He is actually known as the first king of Prussia. So Frederick William there, he's the one who gets the ball rolling, gets everything set up. The recipient, the beneficiary of this is Frederick I, also known as Elector Frederick III, the Ostentatious. He is usually considered the most popular of the Hohenzollern kings. His goal was to imitate the royal court of Louis XIV. He encourages higher education. He begins to found universities. He welcomes immigrant scholars. By the way, he liked Louis so much, he fought 2 wars against Louis just to preserve the balance of power in Europe. And it was this aid that he was dubbed the title King of Prussia, because he was fighting against Louis. The third king on the list is Frederick William I, known as the Soldiers' King. He is probably the most important as far as the development of Prussian absolutism. He's Calvinist like his father. He was obsessed with finding tall soldiers for his army. Like, he thought they were better soldiers. He infused militarism into Prussian society, and Prussia became known as the quote-unquote Sparta of the North. One noble diplomat once stated, quote, "Prussia is not a state with an army, but an army with a state," unquote. This was one of the most militaristic societies in modern times, which again, this is no wonder then when Germany does become unified, it does so under militarism. You remember how I told you that his grandfather, Frederick William over there, that he spent twice as much as Louis XIV on army? Yeah. Frederick William the First actually doubled the size of the army, spent more. Under him, Prussia developed the 4th largest army behind France, Russia, and Austria. 80% of revenue went to the military. And he created one of the most efficient bureaucracies in Europe. He demanded absolute obedience and discipline from civil servants. Again, he's able to control it. Promotions based on merit rather than noble status, which gives him the authority. They owe their allegiance to him. And through high levels of taxation, he is able to control the peasants as well. Now, you may think, well, what good is this guy doing? Well, he has developed absolutism, which could be good or bad, but he will establish approximately 1,000 schools for peasant children. So, not all bad. But I think it's kind of a good place to stop. We'll pick up in part B of this lecture, talk about Russia. But for now, take care. Until next time, bye-bye.